Good evening, yes indeed. I am Mehdi Hasan and I am standing in for Iain Dale tonight. This is the LBC Book Club this hour. We've got two very interesting, provocative guests in the studio promoting and discussing their new books. In the studio with me tonight is Tim Worstall, businessman, writer, blogger, author of the new book Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. And we also have Jessie Norman MP, who is the Tory MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire and the author of the new book, The Big Society, and I'm intrigued to find out what The Big Society is all about. I'm sure all of you at home are. The Prime Minister's been criticised for being unable to coherently or clearly spell it out, but now we've got a book-length argument on what The Big Society is. So we'll be talking with Jessie in the second half of this hour about The Big Society book. But let's begin with Tim and his book, very provocative book, Challenging the Environmental Movement. If you do want to come in, ring in, ask any questions or put any points to either of our authors tonight, you can ring us on 0845 60 60 973. You can text us 84850, email us studio@lbc.co.uk, or you can tweet us at LBC 973. Tim, good evening.
Good evening.
Your book, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. Tell the listeners what the basic argument is. I think the title slightly gives it away, but tell us what your central argument is and what the book's about.
The central argument is that let's assume that climate change is real. Let's assume that it's a serious problem, and let's assume that we need to do something about it. OK, we've assumed all of those things. It's still true that Caroline Lucas, Jonathan Porritt, the New Economics Foundation, and half the people writing on the subject of what we ought to do about climate change are wrong. And what I do in the book is explain what we should be doing, even though we have already assumed that, you know, unlike many people who are supposedly on the right, I'm not trying to say that climate change isn't happening or isn't a problem. What I'm trying to say is, here is what we need to do, and I've taken my information from the same reports, the IPCC reports, which tell us that climate change is happening.
But come to different conclusions.
No, I come to the same conclusions as the IPCC does.
So why are the environmental writers and activists who you mentioned, why are they wrong?
Because they say, well, for example, we need to curtail globalization. We need to restrict it. We need to go back to regionalism, localism, self-sufficiency. I mean, this is a very common thing that people are saying in you know, those sort of writers. And yet when you actually read the IPCC report, you find that they say, well, actually, if we have a globalized world, we will have fewer emissions for a given standard of living than if we have a regionalized world. And therefore, all of those arguing that we should have regionalization as a cure for climate change are, well, to put it politely, they're barking. Because the actual report that proves we got climate change is telling us the opposite.
And you worked, let me just clarify this, do you work in the field of renewable energy yourself?
I am a supplier of the metals, the very weird and exotic metals that are used by some of those renewable technologies, yes.
And let's also just clarify something. You said at the start, let's assume climate change is happening. Is that what you do? You assume it? You don't believe that to be the case?
Oh, I do personally believe it, yes.
You're not a sceptic or a denier or any one of those titles?
No.
So the reason you use the word assume is because you're saying basically, even if you are a sceptic or denier, and even if you believe it or not, the conclusions you come to are the correct conclusions based on the data.
Well, yes, of course I'm right.
Of course you're right. That's what we like. Confident authors, of course, you're right. And so when I say to you, for example, 2010, scientists say is going to be the hottest year on record, you have not a problem with that?
I'm not entirely sure that it's true. I think there is a little bit of spicing up of some of these figures, but if it is true, it is true. I mean,
But man is largely responsible for global warming as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm just checking. Right.
We're all
on the same
okay.
page.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, let's get the statement way out and straight in the open.
Yeah.
Is the world warming up? Yes. Is it largely to do with human beings? Yes. I have my suspicions about how bad a problem it's going to be. About whether positive feedbacks are going to continue to be positive and so on, but in the book, and in all of my other writing on the subject, I basically take the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, as being correct, and then work from there.
And who's this book for? Who's it aimed at, readers-wise? Because if it's aimed at environmentalist green types who you want to kind of convince, persuade, cajole, change their minds, I just came across a quote that you wrote. You wrote a piece on the Guardian website in December last year, and you said, "I'm one of those classical liberal types with the libertarian mindset that sees the carbon cutters as, in general, authoritarian, super-statist, quasi-socialist conspirators intent on bossing people around and interfering with their lives and liberties." You're not really endearing yourselves to the people you might want to change their, who you might want to convince.
Well, there's a combination of, I mean, if you insult somebody for long enough, they might actually start listening to you.
Perhaps.
That particular quote was actually fed to me by Matt Seaton, the editor at Comment is Free, as, could you please write a piece around this concept?
Okay. Blame the Guardian, those dastardly...
I know, the statist liberals, as opposed to classical liberals.
So you don't believe that? You don't believe people who are interested in cutting carbon emissions are authoritarian, super-statist, quasi-socialist conspirators?
Well, yes, I do. I mean,
you do believe that?
That's why Matt fed me the line.
So for example, James Murdoch, son of Rupert, man who runs B Sky B, very, very committed to climate change activism, for strong green credentials, wants to make B Sky B carbon neutral. He's a quasi-socialist, interfering, super-statist conspirator.
Could be. I've never met the man. Couldn't say.
So the Murdochs. What about NATO, which is also committed to climate change, to carbon emission reductions? I'm just wondering. It's a weird label.
Sorry. You're misunderstanding the quote in the first place. In that, I'm not saying that people who wish to reduce carbon emissions are quasi-socialist statists. I mean, the book actually points out what we need to do. We either have cap and trade or we have a carbon tax. One or the other solves the problem. That's it. That's all we have to do.
Just to clarify, your position is that you support a carbon tax?
I personally support a carbon tax because it gives politicians less opportunity to screw things up. Sorry, Jesse.
And just before we come on to some of the other issues raised in your book...
No. Let me just finish this off.
Please do.
My specific complaint about quasi-socialist statists and so on is that there are a number of people out there in the environmental movement, in the green movement, who are using this acknowledged problem to try and impose their own desired solutions. And their own desired solutions have a great deal more to do with their desire to have a quasi-socialist state than it is about solving climate change, which is one of the points of the book.
But couldn't the same accusation be levelled at you and people...
I'm sure every accusation could be levelled at me.
Couldn't the specific accusation about ideology and using it as a programme for implementing it be applied to a lot of people who advocate, quote, market-based solutions to the climate problem, which is just saying, actually, it's an ideological belief, it's a faith in markets being the solution to everything, and therefore, confronted with an ecological problem, an environmental catastrophe, the market is right.
Nobody is saying that the free market is going to be the solution, because there is no such thing as a free market. All markets are constrained, are regulated. It depends on what are the regulations and who's doing the regulating. The second part is that the pollution, CO2, it's an externality. This is a well-known problem. We had it was Alfred Marshall, the founder of neoclassical economics, who really explained it all. The idea turns up in Hayek's The Road to Serfdom.
Just for the listeners, explain what you mean by an externality, a negative.
Okay, if I'm working in a market and I do something that creates a cost to somebody else, if I don't pay that cost, then I'm encouraged to do whatever it is, more of it than I ought to be. So, for example, emitting CO2. I don't pay anything to emit CO2. Therefore, I'm emitting more CO2 than I would do if I was actually paying the cost of doing so. That's called an externality. It's external to the market. It's not included in market prices. Externalities, well-known problem. We've known what to do about them for the last 90 years. Yes, the climate change is an externalities problem. What you don't do is then close down the market. You introduce the externality into market prices. So it's absolutely not me or anybody else saying, hey, great, the free market's going to sort it all out, it's going to be paradise. No, we understand that markets do go wrong, do need regulation, do need to be changed, and what we have to work out is what is the best way in any particular circumstance. Now, I discuss in the book, should we use cap and trade, like the European Union's ETS system, EUTS, isn't it? Or should we use a carbon tax? Now, I say we should use a carbon tax for the simple reason that politicians tend not to do these things very well, so the less political interference we have, the better off we're going to be. But my acknowledgement is absolutely that the free market, pure and unadorned, will not solve this problem. So the question is, what do we add to the free market in order to solve it?
And just before we go on to some of the specific issues you raise in the book, you're described on the jacket of the book as, quote, jaw-droppingly rude. Now, as someone who's been described in similar terms myself in the past, don't you find that can often turn as many people off as it turns on?
I'm not actually really worried about having sexual relationship with my readers, and turn on, turn off. I mean, it's not really the point. To have somebody like Tim Harford say that I'm being jaw-droppingly rude is, I think, at my stage, is one of those all publicity is good publicity as long as they spell the name right.
Fair enough. We're going to carry on talking with Tim and with Jesse later on in a few moments and taking your calls. You can call us 0845 60 60 973, text us 84850 or email us studio@lbc.co.uk. The time now is 9:15. Time now for the Travel with Alan.
Tonight from 10, LBC 97.3.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Iain Dale. I've got Jesse Norman, Tory MP for Hereford here, waiting to discuss his book, The Big Society. And we've got Tim Worstall, businessman, writer and blogger, who's here to promote his book, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. We've been talking about his book. I just want to throw out the number to you all if you want to join this discussion and see whether you agree with Tim. 0845 60 60 973, text us 84850. Do you agree with Tim that the green agenda is wrong? Quote, to use his rather strident phrase at the top, that they've got it all wrong, that globalisation isn't a barrier to tackling climate change, and that local self-sufficiency is not the way to go in terms of cutting emissions and dealing with the problem. I want to bring Jesse in a moment to see what his take is on all this. But just before I do that, I just want to ask you, in the book you talk about the inefficiency of some of the green agenda's economic solutions. For example, the idea that the bailout, the stimulus, the recovery of the economy in these tough times that we're in can be a green recovery and have green jobs. And in the book you quote Alistair Darling talking about the idea of creating more than 1 million jobs in green industries. And you mock that idea and you say that's 1 million people not doing something else. These jobs are a cost to us, not a benefit. But isn't that only true when the economy is at full employment? If we've got 2.5 million unemployed people, isn't that a good thing to find 1 million people work in green industries?
Sure, I'm perfectly happy with the idea of stimulus and creating jobs. Keynes is digging holes and filling them in again. But we're actually building the energy infrastructure that we're going to use for the next 40 years. So if we go and create 1 million green jobs in this new energy infrastructure, we're therefore assuming that we're going to be in a recession for the next 40 years. Which sounds a little odd to me, really. That's probably not what we want to do.
So you're taking a longer view of this, in that sense?
As I say, I completely understand the idea that when there's unemployed labour around, perhaps we might want to use the labour to do something. I've no particular problem with that idea. But specifically, I argue against Caroline Lucas's idea from the Green Party manifesto that wind power is lovely and wonderful because it requires hundreds more jobs for each terawatt of power that you produce than does, say, coal or nuclear or whatever. And the reductio ad absurdum of that is that actually, if we hooked up bicycles to the grid, and we decided that people should just pedal away to power the country, we'd actually create 3.4 million jobs for every terawatt of power we produced, which maybe that's a good idea in the middle of a recession, but it's probably not the way we actually want to try and build the electricity system for the next 40 years.
OK. Listening to that in the studio here with me is Jesse Norman, Tory MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire. A Cameroon, in some people's views, very close to the modernising faction of the Conservative Party, which, of course, rebranded itself, some would say, with its commitment to the environment, Cameron hugging huskies, lots of talk about this being the greenest government ever. What's your take on Tim's book and his views on the environmental movement and some of the consensus positions that politicians have adopted in terms of cutting emissions?
Well, I haven't read Tim's book, but I do think that it's a very clever idea to take the assumptions that some of these kind of green campaigners have, and show how they actually lead in completely different directions from the way they may have originally anticipated. And the cleverness lies in the fact that it doesn't matter whether you share those assumptions or not. It's an argument that stands on its own terms, and therefore it reveals a logical incoherence in the position that they take. And I also would agree with several of the things that Tim has said today, although not all of it. It's obviously true that you can have more or less efficient ways of generating energy. We could all sit at home twiddling our thumbs, and I have no doubt that if 50 million people did that, we'd generate half a terawatt of power, but it wouldn't be a very clever way to run an economic policy. Where I think I would disagree is that I think I take more your point, Mehdi, about a commitment to free markets, not that there is such a thing as a free market in the perfect sense, as it is in itself an ideology. We should be aware of that. And I don't mean that it's in a strong sense a kind of it's a daft set of views in and of itself, but it does reflect a commitment. And there certainly are views that are so free market as to be, I think, very questionable now. And one of the reasons why we had a problem with the last financial crash was because some of these views took hold in the official mind and were not adequately thought through or compensated by other views as well.
Tim, do you want to respond to what Jesse was saying?
Well, I don't think it's all that much of a surprise that I'm fairly free market. I am a fellow at the Adam Smith Institute.
You are indeed.
It's one of those.
Although earlier you were saying there's no such thing as a free market.
There is no such thing as a purely free market. No, the question is who regulates and how it's regulated.
Well,
the other question is, the other question that's interesting is do you think the market is an end in itself, or do you think the market is a way of solving a problem? And I have no idea if Tim holds this view, but there certainly are some people who are just interested in markets as such and want to use them wherever they possibly can. And I think that's slightly crazy. It seems to me the point about a market is that it's a cultural institution. It's embedded in our society in some way. We use them because they can do certain things. If we don't think they're doing a very good job, we've got other means associated, available to us, and therefore we can be clever about how we use markets and not necessarily just, as it were, treated ideologically.
And just on the green point specifically, I mentioned that there was this pledge from the very top of the government that this will be, from both Liberal Democrats and Tories in this coalition, this will be the greenest government, I think, ever. Do you think that they'll be able to stick to that? Do you think we've seen evidence of that so far?
Well, I think we're starting to see a lot of evidence for it. There are obviously well-developed plans to revolutionise some of the things that are being done in electricity generation or in house insulation or in the Green Investment Bank. We're at a very early stage of the government. An enormous amount of the legislation we've seen so far has been about delivering one or two key planks of the early coalition and also about repealing some very bad legislation of the previous government. So it'll really be interesting to see over the next 6 months and 12 months how that starts to pan out.
And Tim, someone's just texted in, perhaps someone who shares a similar view of markets and as you, saying, my concern is that climate change is being used as an excuse to tax and regulate us. What's your response to that?
There has to be tax and regulation, or tax or regulation. That's what cap and trade or carbon tax is. When markets fail, you do need to either tax them in order to get them back into line, or you need to regulate them through cap and trade. The question that you often, the line of thinking that you often see is that this particular market has failed in this particular instance on this particular problem, and therefore we should abandon markets altogether. And my argument is no, that's not quite right. What we've got is this particular market has failed in this particular instance on this particular problem. Now, what do we have to do to make that market work in this particular instance on this particular problem? And again, just from the neoclassical economics, and in fact, the cap and trade programs from the EU, or carbon tax here, or Ken Clarke was the guy who brought in the fuel duty escalator. All the way back in 92, 93.
Okay.
These are all solutions to those problems.
We're just coming up to the news very quickly. One last question. In your chapter, in your contents page, I thought it was quite interesting. You've got all these chapters on growth, globalisation, population market, and then you've got chapter 2, recycling, which seems like a bit of a parochial concern on your part. You seem quite worried about how much we recycle. Surely it doesn't cost us that much, and it's not that much of a bother. And we are running out of landfill space.
No, we're not running out of landfill space. We take out...
supposedly we're going to run out in 8 years, according to local government associations.
Yes, but we're running out of space that's licensed for landfill. We dig holes of about 100 million cubic metres a year, and we have about 100 million cubic metres of rubbish. There's no problem. It's licenses, and it's explained in that chapter.
But you would happily carry on digging holes rather than focusing on recycling?
I specifically wanted to talk about some original economic research that I've done, which is what that recycling chapter is about. And it's in the way that we don't actually get included in the political discussion of what's going on, all of the costs of what are actually involved. When people talk about high-speed rail, they say the time saved on the trains is a benefit. When people talk about recycling, we should therefore also talk about the time that people have to spend recycling as a cost of recycling. But we don't.
Okay. Well, thanks so very much. We've been talking with Tim Worstall about his new book, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. Jesse Norman, Tory MP for Herefordshire, is here to talk about his book also, The Big Society, and Tim will be sticking around to discuss that also. After the news, you can give us a ring and join the discussion on 0845 6060 973.
Standing in for Iain Dale, Mehdi Hasan.
This is the LBC Book Club. Tim Worstall and Jesse Norman are here talking about their books, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims, and The Big Society, which we'll be talking about for the rest of this hour. But before we do that, Clive Bull's here. He's going to be with us at 10 o'clock. He's taking over from me. Clive, what's on the show tonight?
Well, coming up tonight at 10, first of all, since this is the Book Club, we are going to be talking about Britain's second best-selling author.
Who of
course, is, any ideas?
God.
Tim Worstall.
It's Jamie Oliver. Unbelievably. He's
after J.K. Rowling, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm going to try and find out who is buying all these cookbooks and whether anyone's actually doing any cooking as a result of these books, or do they just sit in the cupboard somewhere. We're also going to look ahead to tomorrow. Having looked at the forecast, I mean, it does look like there's quite a lot of snow could hit London during the day, and after midnight it's going to begin to pitter-patter down, which would be nice for some people and not for others.
Commuters who've had a bad day today, you can imagine how bad it'll be tomorrow.
Exactly, and also not for student protesters. So I wonder if that might affect the turnout. Some are saying this will be the biggest yet.
The students, they can have a snowball fight.
Yeah, or they just stay in bed. Yeah, we will see. So I'm going to find out what people have planned for tomorrow in that respect. And also women to remain banned from fighting on the front line. Is that sensible or fair? We'll talk about that and much more after 10.
Lucky them, I say. That will be Clive Bull taking over from me at 10 o'clock. You're listening to LBC 97.3. I'm Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Iain Dale. This is the LBC Book Club. We've been talking about the environment and climate change with businessman and blogger Tim Worstall, who's published a new book, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. And now we're talking with Jesse Norman. Tim is still here, by the way, in the studio. And Jesse Norman, new Tory MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire, elected earlier this year, a former executive director of the think tank Policy Exchange, described by many as a Cameroon, and author of the book The Big Society. And on the back of this book, there's a quote from the Prime Minister David Cameron. You can call it liberalism, you can call it empowerment, you can call it freedom, you can call it responsibility. I call it the big society. And that slightly is the problem. You can call it all sorts of things, and people all seem to have different definitions and interpretations. But Jesse Norman has very bravely written a whole book on the guiding principle of this coalition government, or at least the Conservative Party. Jesse, why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote it because I'd been thinking about these issues for an indecently long period of time, about 20 years. And when we suddenly get a politics and a politician who looks like they're putting some of these things into practice, I thought it would be crazy not to try and write it all up and put it in words.
And you're saying put it into practice. What is the big society? Can you define it for our listeners in a single sentence, 2 sentences maybe?
Well, I rather like that moment when Tim Loughton, who's the a minister, was asked, and he said, "Is it Anne Widdecombe?" And the answer is, no, it isn't Anne Widdecombe. But I think it's about 2 things. One is helping people to help themselves, and the second is building up social capital in a country, in a society, in a way that we build up economic capital in an economy. So put those 2 things together and you get the idea of the big society. But it's famously resistant to any sound bites, and I rather like that. I mean, when it came out during the election, the Tories were roundly criticised for using the big society, and everyone was scratching their heads and trying to work out what it meant. I was secretly thrilled, because it seemed to me it was something that obviously hadn't been focus grouped. It was obviously came from the heart. It was obviously sincere, and how nice to have something in a world of politics that is sincere. There isn't much of that around.
Well, just I should remind you all listening at home, Jesse's saying he likes the idea that it's not focus grouped or easily sound-biteable. What do you think the big society means? Give us a ring, 0845 6060 973, text us 84850. We could compare your definition of the big society with Tory MP Jesse Norman's definition. He's written an entire book on it. Now, you say it's resistant to soundbites. Some would say that's because it's so woolly, and you mentioned Tim Loughton and his little gag about Anne Widdecombe. He did say, the full quote is, the trouble is, in a speech earlier this month, the children's minister said, the trouble is that most people don't know what the big society really means, least of all the unfortunate ministers who have to articulate it. He went on to say, what actually is the big society, let alone is it good or not? Exactly how big is it now, or is it going to be? Those are legitimate questions, aren't they, Jesse, from one of your fellow Tory MPs?
I think he's absolutely right to say that many people don't have a clear understanding, and that's because, like a lot of big concepts, it's intrinsically fuzzy. But what it isn't is vacuous. It has got a lot of content, and we can talk about the different aspects of it. Some of it is about, as I've said, voluntarism and helping people to help themselves. Another strand would be about localism, about trying to push power down towards people in communities rather than have it centralised at the centre. Another aspect would be about getting our economy to thrive through focusing on institutions and competition and entrepreneurship. I mean, now there are different elements to it, and I talk about all those in the book.
But it's like Labour's third way, which when you define it so broadly, a lot of people say, well, who would disagree with that? Who would disagree with sending power down to community? Who would disagree with supporting entrepreneurs? Who would disagree with empowering people? I mean, it's motherhood and apple pie.
I actually don't think that's true, and in fact there are two specific viewpoints that it rebuts, if you like. One is someone who believes that the state is the answer to social problems, and that really has been the position of the government for the last 13 years. So they don't get a look in because this is, as it were, statism. I mean, it says the state is important as far as it goes, public services are vital, but it's not always the right way to improve public services to have them delivered through the state and funded by the taxpayer. And then the second group that it rebuts would be what you would call crazy libertarians who say, look, the free market is the answer to everything, and the reason it doesn't, and actually I would exempt Tim from this. Tim's much too clever to be in this group. But for example, it would say, listen, if you think that's true, then you haven't been paying attention to any of the behavioural economic literature of the last 20 years, which shows that actually people in the aggregate do behave differently from the way you think they do. And let me give a quick example of that. If you think people in perfect neoclassical economics, people have an identical attitude towards all parts of the future, but we now know that actually they really only care about the period in the next 2 years. So if you offer someone a mortgage that's got a 1% rate for 2 years and then a 10% rate for years 3 to 25, they may take it. And that's a lot of the reason why we had this enormous crash was because those kinds of features of people's individual economic psychology were exploited by the banks and by the markets.
But aren't you, on your first argument, aren't you caricaturing the Labour side, the left side, the government side, saying government is a solution to problem, is the answer to everything? It's ludicrous to believe that Tony Blair thought that government was the answer to everything in his 10 years as Prime Minister. I mean, over the 13 years of Labour period, I think something like 30,000 new charities were created. The idea that society wasn't big or communities weren't strong or voluntary groups weren't thriving over the last 13 years, isn't that just a caricature?
No, well, of course it's an extreme characterisation of the position in order to get a sense of what the differences are. But actually, the last government was very statist and very centralising. And what is fascinating is that Blair only really woke up to the value of trying to make institutions more independent relatively late. And you see that with foundation trusts and in hospitals and with some of the work that they were trying to do with schools. So they woke up to the idea of independent institutions. And actually, charities, which you mentioned, are the perfect example of this. If you talk, I've raised tons and tons of money for charity in different forms. I'm involved in dozens of little charities, and I can tell you that many charities now, if you say, have you been out fundraising, what they think you mean is raising money from government through different pots.
So government shouldn't support charities?
No, that's a ridiculous caricature. Of course the government, there'll be some where the government is in a position of supporting them and should continue to do that. What I'm saying is that there are many which are utterly dependent on government, and actually a thriving voluntary sector, a thriving charitable sector, is about liberating all those other resources that you don't get through the taxpayer and through the state.
So you're not worried, for example, when Dame Susie Leather, who's head of the Charities Commission, says thousands of charities could be crippled by public spending cuts and could undermine the whole idea of a big society. You're not worried because you say those charities should survive on their own 2 feet?
No, again, that's a complete caricature. Of course one would be worried in the short term about what happens to those charities, because those charities have become dependent dependent on state funding. What I'm talking about is what is the situation you want to work towards, which is independent institutions freely interacting with each other. And the tragedy of the last 13 years is that so many independent institutions have become utterly dependent on the government tap and of money, and that is a problem, and we have to move away from it slowly.
And you mentioned this, the last government was very statist. Some would argue that it only got statist in the last few years when it had to get statist. For example, the financial crash, the takeover of the banks, the stimulus. How would the big society have rescued the banks?
Oh, the big society as an idea doesn't have any problem at all, particularly, I think, with pulling the ripcord. What the government did in the last 2 years, the period from 2008 to 10, was it basically pulled the emergency cord. It did whatever it could. It used the power of the nation state to tax people and to use that money to fund its own purchases of the banks and to run up the deficit. That's just what happens when the train hits the buffers. The real criticism is what happened before that. And if you read the book, what you'll see is I actually show that in 2007-8, there was every reason to think before the crash struck that the economy was in a dire state. We were growing much more slowly, oddly enough, when you adjust for the population and for one or two other things, than other OECD countries. We were deeply in debt as a nation and personally. We had mortgaged ourselves up the wazoo, buying plasma screens on negative equity in our houses, and that was a terrible, terrible failure of governance.
And what do you say to the classic complaint about the big society, which is that it is simply a cover for all these cuts that are coming along? You're going to cut back on spending, you're going to cut back on public services, and the cover is, well, actually, it's because we're trying to empower communities and society.
Well, of course, as Andy Rice Davis famously said, they would say that, wouldn't they? And this is, I'm afraid, a kind of piece of Labour politicking. The truth of the matter is that the idea of the big society and the kinds of things that, in particular, David Cameron's been talking about, date from 2005 at least, and therefore way before the current crash. And what is interesting about the situation we have at the moment is that actually many of the same principles can be used to get us out of these holes, but it absolutely isn't a cover for cuts. These cuts have got to take place because, as we've seen with the Irish situation, we were in a desperately fragile position in May, and someone had to take control of the situation. And let me just say one other thing about that, which is that these cuts, no one is happy about making cuts. None of my colleagues want to do this. None of them are happy about it. They think it's in the nation's interest, and they are very reluctantly having to conquer their concerns in order to do what they think is right.
That's not strictly true, is it?
No,
Jesse,
I think it is
you
true.
might not be a small state conservative, but a lot of your colleagues are ideological small state conservatives who want to reduce the proportion of public spending as a proportion of national income. Surely that's... You're not going to deny that.
And I certainly think that the state is overextended myself. What I'm saying is no one is happy about having to create a programme of cuts. We would always prefer it if we could have grown our way out of this problem. That option is not available to us because of the situation we've been placed in by the last government.
Jesse, we're going to come back and continue this very interesting discussion and bring Tim in just a moment. The time now is 9:45. Time for the travel with Alan Joyce.
Thank you, Ben. Available now at lbc.co.uk.
This is the LBC Book Club with me, Mehdi Hasan, sitting in for Iain Dale. We're talking about The Big Society with the Tory MP Jesse Norman, who's written a whole book on it called The Big Society. We've also got Tim Worstall, who's still here, who was talking about his book, Chasing Rainbows, earlier in the hour. I'm going to bring Tim in just a moment to see what he thinks about The Big Society and Jesse's views. Before we do that, I just want to ask, Jesse, where's the evidence that people want to run local services, be active in their communities, as, for example, the big society seems to imply or demand? Where's the, we hear Tory ministers talking about empowering communities and volunteers looking after certain services in their local town. Where's the evidence that anyone wants to do that or has the time or inclination to do so?
Well, I think the truth is there isn't an enormous amount of evidence either way, and these questions haven't really been asked much. And also, certainly, part of the problem with having more influence over something is that it carries responsibility with it, and people tend to flee responsibility. So the evidence is indirect, and the best source of evidence, oddly enough, is to look at other countries. And as you may know, there's a wonderful book called The Spirit Level, which looks at the performance of many different countries. And one of the things that brings out, which is so fascinating, is that actually we just don't have to be in the place we are at the moment. We could be doing much better on all these social indicators like teenage pregnancy and drug abuse and things like that. And one of the things that distinguishes those is that some of these countries, many of these countries, have got much greater local control of services, and so that would be an indirect argument for localism.
Hold on. You mentioned the spirit level. The spirit level is about how equal countries with a greater, a more equal distribution of income and wealth do better. We are a very unequal country with a government that doesn't spend as much money on public services as, for example, Scandinavian countries do. So I could argue the exact reverse to that. I could argue actually Scandinavian countries, which spend more money on public services, have stronger societies, more social capital, higher volunteer rates, etc., etc.
It's certainly true that the spirit level tries to make that argument. I'm starting at the earlier point and just saying, look, the really thing that's interesting about the spirit level is that it charts all of these differences in the different societies to start off with. That's the real message. Of course, if you look at the book itself, what you'll recall is that the spirit level actually doesn't make an argument for large redistribution of income, because they're aware that the ways in which you get to higher, better social outcomes are not necessarily through taxing people more and redistributing it through the state. So the spirit level is just really an example to show how many countries differ. If you look at Scandinavian countries, like, for example, Sweden, often caricatured as a high-tax, high-spend country, well, what's interesting about it is high-tax, high-spend. It's very localist in things like education, and those are lessons that we're starting to learn.
So it's not technically caricatured as high-tax, high-spend, it is still high-tax, high-spend.
It's caricatured correctly.
Tim, what's your take on what you've been listening to?
I was just coming in on that. I mean, for example, localism. For example, Denmark does have very high income taxes, yes, but the national income tax rate is 3.76%. And the top national income tax rate in Denmark is 15%.
Okay, but sticking specifically with what Jesse's been saying.
Income taxes...
Yeah, I'm enjoying this, Mehdi. You're so on the sake. Let's let Tim do his thing.
Paid by communes. And a commune might be a unit as small as 10,000 people. And I actually really do believe that people are much, much happier in paying higher taxes. Now, that localism, I'm sure, is hugely important about the way in which the Nordic countries actually work.
I mean, there's a really interesting example, which also is France. As you know, France has got a mayor in every town and village, something like 35,000 mayors in the country. Simon Jenkins tells a marvellous story about a friend of his who had something stolen from a house in France and complains to the mayor, and 3 days later a young man knocks on the door and says, look, I'm terribly sorry, here it is back, and, how can I help you? So there is there is a kind of value to localism which we're missing in this ultra-centralised world we have.
I'll come back to the localism in a minute. Just, Tim, overall, I mean, you are a free market libertarian. Jesse's exempted you from his caricature extreme position.
I'm not a libertarian, I'm a classical liberal.
Okay.
The difference being that classical liberals do understand that sometimes markets aren't the appropriate method of...
So what do you think, when you hear David Cameron talk about the big society, you go, yes, spot on?
Well, no. I mean, of course, I think that David Cameron's a dreadful, rather wet lefty, but the big society, to me, I absolutely do not understand this problem that the left in the UK has with this idea of the big society. Because actually what is being said, although it's not actually being said out loud, the implication is that we're going to go back to that great flowering of the British working classes, with the friendly societies, with the mutuals. I mean, the whole creation of the building societies was done by the British working classes on their own, because the vote stealers got out of the way and let them get on with it. And that, to me, is what the big society is about. Clear all of the bureaucrats, the politicians out of the way.
As the only person in the room who's on the left, let me just say a word in defence of the left, being the neutral presenter that I'm known to be. Look, my problem is this, Jesse and Tim. How can a society be called a big society when... Let's go back to those awkward cuts that have to be made, according to your government. How can it be big when you're going to see swimming pools closed, leisure centres closed, libraries closed, youth clubs closed? That is a smaller society, not a bigger society, in my view.
Well, I have to say, I just think you're confusing a process of necessary correction.
That's fine, it may be necessary, but do you accept it will make society smaller? Without those leisure centres?
No, I absolutely
without the libraries?
I absolutely do not accept that, and I'm sure Tim is the same way. The truth of the matter is that these things will go through, and what you will discover is that social energy will be liberated by the requirement that people have to deal with a difficult situation in adversity.
What does that mean, social energy? You're retreating into... If a swimming pool shuts down because a local local authority can no longer afford to pay for it because this government has planned in 28% cuts in local spending over 4 years. How does social energy, whatever that is, bring that swimming pool back for the local community?
Well, because what you will find is that alternative activities will be created by young people. Let me give an example. We've got a hall in Hereford, where I live, which was built as part of a development of a supermarket, never basically used. We've now raised £45,000. We're turning it into a youth community theatre. That has not got one penny of government money involved in it. It is a purely local community activity.
That's not going to happen across the country, is it, Jesse? It's not going to happen in some of the more poorer inner city areas. It's
on the contrary, the people who are most going to benefit are the very poorest in society, and those were the groups who organised themselves in the institutions that Tim's describing. If you had looked at Britain in the year 1900, you would have seen on the left, you would have seen a fabulous array of different traditions, including guild socialism, co-ops, mutuals, unions, non-conformists and dissenters, civil libertarians, anarchists, Marxists, communists. You would not have seen a monotone, statist political party. And Labour, as a political party, has created this.
Now you're doing the caricature.
No,
Jesse,
I'm not.
surely.
Not. And let me explain why it's a mistake. Which is that the British people know that a purely sectional political party, based on an appeal just to Labour, rather than this much wider tradition of Labour, of left, group of left traditions, is not going to be of interest. That's why, if you look at the difference between the left and right before 1920 and afterwards, broadly speaking, what you find is they split it 47-53 to the Tories before 1920, and after that there's an 8% drop in the left vote. And that's 7 years of Labour government lost because it retreated from a broad left position into a Labour statist view. And if you look at European countries which maintained a broad left coalition, they didn't do that. And if you look at the Democrats in America, which maintained a broad left coalition, they didn't do that. So actually this retreat into a purely Labour Party from the broad left has been a disaster for the left in this country.
Let me just, before we finish, let me just broaden out very quickly. You mentioned earlier Ireland and spending cuts, necessary corrections, all of that stuff. We've had the Office for Budget Responsibility report out today. There's been some good news in there for the government, pointing out that this year's growth has been revised upwards. 350,000, not 490,000 public sector jobs.
330
versus 490,000 jobs are going to go. So fewer jobs than we thought are going to go in the public sector, according to those figures, although not according to all economists. But then you've seen some other bad news. Growth figures over the next couple of years have been revised downwards. They're talking about sluggish growth. What's your response?
Well, the truth of the matter is, I was in the debate this afternoon, is that these figures are almost entirely good for the government. What is clear is that the OBR has done a terrific job of rigorising and making more transparent and explicit the economic projections for the country. That's good and a government initiative. The country looks like it's going to avoid a double-dip recession, contrary to the predictions of the left 6 months ago. That's good. And the cost in labour terms of the cuts is going to be cut by a third. So all of that is good. Now, we may get slower growth in the middle of next year. Let's see.
But it's looking like a largely jobless recovery, relatively speaking. There's still going to be more people claiming benefits in 2015, according to these figures, than there were before the crash.
Mehdi, it is not savage not to spend money you don't have. It is savage to rack up huge debts which others then have to deal with. That has been the problem we have over the last 10 years.
Jesse Norman, thanks very much. Tim Worstall was here talking about his book, Chasing Rainbows, How the Green Agenda Defeats Its Aims. Jesse Norman's been talking about the big society, both the concept and his book. I remember Oscar Wilde once said the problem with socialism is it requires too many evenings. Some might say the same about the big society. You're listening to LBC 97.3. The time now is 9:58. Iain Dale is back tomorrow. And Clive Bull's next.